Hi, good evening to everyone. And in some parts of the globe, it's a good morning or a good afternoon. We are here on our webinar entitled Democracy Endangered. I am Justine Balane. I'm the Secretary General of Akbayan Youth, a democratic socialist organization in the Philippines. And I will be moderating this panel discussion uh, this evening. I will first read the rationale of our webinar for this evening. But at the same time, we are live on Zoom and we are also live on Facebook. With now more than 4.7 million cases around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world in a drastic scale. We didn't just struggle with a health crisis. Countries around the world have also seen delayed elections, declarations of state of emergency, suspension of parliament, curfews, and confinement. The COVID-19 health crisis led to a global halt of democratic activity and suspensions of the rule of law all around the globe. Without checks and balances, some governments have abused the situation and have passed controversial laws, repressed opposition groups, and endangered populations. It's almost as if authoritarians around the world are racing against the virus and who gets to harm more people first. So our speakers tonight are youth activists who are standing up and mobilizing against oppressive governments and fighting for the continuation of democracy. So I'll introduce you to our youth activists who are joining our panel for tonight. We have Anđjela Ruvidic from Serbia of the group Davimo Beograd.
Hello.
We also, hi Anđjela. We also have Fernando Quintana from Corporacion 4 de Agosto of Chile. We're also joined tonight by Sam Muyizzi from the Democratic Party of Uganda.
Hello.
So for tonight, this webinar will go for an hour and a half. I have prepared a set of questions for our speakers, which they will give concise answers to, but you can also drop your questions in the Q&A box right below. Okay, so our first question for tonight to our panel of speakers. How is the rule of law and democracy being threatened in your country? Let's hear from Anđjela first.
Thank you. Today, Serbia is only declaratively democratic state. The president of Serbia, Aleksandar Vučić, he seized all the power for himself. He made the work of institutions and courts totally meaningless. Laws in Serbia are applied selectively and corruption is at a very high level. Of course, it all affects everyday life of citizens. Just a few days ago, an international organization, Freedom House, submitted a new report on the state of democracy in Serbia. In their report, they estimated that corruption has increased in Serbia in last year, especially corruption at a high level. And they said that already fragile anti-corruption institutions have been further weakened now. There are just a few investigations and even a smaller amount of verdicts in those cases. So it seems that the problem of high-level corruption is getting even worse in Serbia. Investigative bodies, they ignore the findings of investigative journalists. Their ruling party officials and tabloids also do their best to discredit those journalists who expose corruption. In Serbia, most print and electronic media are controlled by the ruling party. So now media serve to spread propaganda, and they are used to praise the ruling party and its leader, the president of Serbia, and at the same time they demonize their critics and opponents. The ruling party has marginalized the opposition. In Serbia, the opposition does not feel that it can effectively advocate the policy changes because the ruling party have been working to deprive it of opportunity and doubts that it could ever win power in the elections. Even opposition parties left parliament in Serbia late last year because the ruling party made the parliament's work completely meaningless. At the sessions of the assembly, the members of parliament of ruling party, they prevent other MPs from participating in the debate or proposing even any new ideas that differ from their own ideas. So people in Serbia now, and even in the last few years, they're blackmailed. Employees in state institutions are forced to go to rallies organized by the ruling party. They're forced to vote for them in the elections, and they even need to provide proof of that in form of photo or something similar. Otherwise, people lose their jobs, and which of course further affects their lives. Now in Serbia, a link between politics at the highest level and a crime has never been this strong. But we also have the honest media and investigative journalists who report truthfully and independently, but not a lot of people can hear them because televisions with the national frequency, they belong to ruling party. So they dictate what will be broadcast, and they dictate what, let's say, 80% of population of Serbia should believe in. So now in Serbia, the independent media are under terrible pressure every day. That's for now about Serbia from me.
Thank you, Anđjela, for sharing about the situation in Serbia. We'll now hear from Fernando on the situation in Chile.
Thank you. So the first thing to say is that similar to Serbia, in Chile, we also do not have a legitimate democracy. Our democracy is a pseudo-democracy. Our constitution was enacted during Pinochet's dictatorship in the 1980. And so the constitutional frame of our regulation is not seen as legitimate by the people of Chile. Actually, that is one of the main causes for the social protests that we had during October of the last year in Chile. And so the consequences of the sanitary crisis must be understood in the context of this larger social crisis that has been incubating for years in Chile and that finally exploded last year. Actually, now we are in a state of emergency decreed by the President Piñera, but this is our second state of emergency in less than 6 months. The last state of emergency was decreed to eliminate, to repress the protests against him. So how has the rule of law and democracy being threatened? Well, that is actually a very complicated thing. During last year's protests, one of our main conquests was the establishment of a constituent process. The constituent process was to begin in April this year, and through that constituent process, we expected to eliminate the Pinochet's constitution and to replace it with something different, something new, something more open to social justice, because our current constitution is nothing more than the enactment of the neoliberal social and economical principles. And that constituent process was postponed because of the COVID crisis. And that may be logical because a constituent process beginning with, I don't know, popular voting, assemblies, and so on, could be a health hazard in in the context of the COVID. But in the same time, as the President Piñera postponed the constituent process, he reopened the commerce, the shopping malls, and he keeps sending people to their jobs. So one might ask oneself, has the postponement of the constituent process obeyed to a legitimate worry for the population health, or has it obeyed to an attempt to secure the actual constitution, which actually benefits the rich people in Chile, one of which Piñera is actually a member? We have a president that is also one of the biggest entrepreneurs in Chile. And so we have a serious problem, because in times of crisis, one should be able to trust their leaders. One should be able to legitimately believe that your leaders want the best thing for you. But in Chile, we are convinced otherwise. We are convinced that President Piñera and his government actually advocates for the rich people, not for the people of Chile. And so a lot of people don't trust the authority, and that is a problem, because sometimes the measures that the authority tries to enforce are not followed because people don't trust him. So our actual leaderships are not being like what we needed to confront this crisis. And well, one final detail for this first presentation is that we have curfews now in Chile, and those curfews are not being enforced by the civil police. They are being enforced by the military forces. And I really don't know what was the necessity of taking the military forces to the streets. We don't need them. We need more resources for healthcare. We need more resources for people who are not able to work. We do not need the military on the streets. And so I believe that Piñera is taking this crisis as a second step to repress the protests from last year, rather than a way of taking care of his people's health. And that would be it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. We're seeing similarities with Serbia and Chile. How is the situation in Uganda? Sam, tell us all about it.
Well, first, it's a pleasure that I have this space, because it's the only space that is left for us to enjoy. Well, it's a good question on how the space is in Uganda today, but we can't forget that the civic space has always been in peril in Uganda, even before COVID. Democracy has been in danger in Uganda. Political participation has been a privilege of those in the ruling party. We have a country where we have had a president in power for now 35 years. He is a dictator that came in against political participation from other political groupings until 2005, when arising out of international pressure, space for political parties to participate was opened up. But we remain to see a one-state dictatorship where the governing party is so fused with the state institutions that you cannot separate the institution of the state from the political party in power. So now, now COVID, I think just actually provided a blank check for President Museveni to enjoy further that has been ongoing even before COVID. Before COVID, you could not do politics as a political party without obtaining a permit from the police, which police is more or less another arm. As I said, since the party in power is fused with the institutions of the state, so the police and other institutions of the state serve the ruling party. Now that we are in the COVID era, they have more reasons to use that blank check to continue checking down on the political gatherings in the country. Of course, it's understandable that there is a health crisis, there's a health situation. But now, as we speak, freedom of movement can only be guaranteed upon a presidential directive. We are seeing institutions of the state. The courts have been closed. Parliament is restricted. Actually, instead of laws coming from Parliament to guide on the regulations during the COVID era, it's the other way around. It's a pronouncement of the president that becomes the law to guide on how we proceed. As I speak now, right about now, the president is being awaited so that he brings other decrees or laws, and then Parliament will follow. Now, with the freedom of movement curtailed, we are seeing a lot of issues. Of course, right now we have a curfew. When you restrict movement, it means other health issues follow. We have seen women failing to get health care or assistance, even when going to give birth. Why? Because after curtailing the freedom of movement, it means someone needs a permit to go to give birth, a permit which can take probably a day or so. So we've seen several deaths emanating from other health issues, not even COVID. We have slightly over 200 cases in Uganda. And actually, we have not seen anyone die in Uganda yet. Many have healed, but we continue seeing more restrictions because the president is enjoying the space at the expense of democratic activity. We have also seen undertones from the sitting president who are supposed to have elections, for example, next year. The general elections calendar was supposed to start right about now. But most of those processes have been extended, all in the name of the COVID-19. So precisely on how the rule of law and democracy is being threatened now. It has been threatened for the last, I don't know, so many years, post-colonial period in Uganda, where we've not seen any president being changed out of a ballot. People have been coming to government through coups, jumping over dead bodies, coming to government through a barrel of the gun. Now we have the laws which serve the president. The president does not serve within the law. So now during this era, where it is internationally accepted that you can curtail political gatherings and political meetings, that you can curtail freedom of expression, that you can postpone elections using the guise of COVID-19, and that you can restrict movement only to those that you decide can move, it leaves a lot to be expected. We are watching the space, and we hope we can start the struggle now as political activists so that we continue putting the pressure. Before COVID, we will not be given the chance to speak and even express ourselves politically. It's going to be harder. Right now, just a few of my activists have been taken into prison because they are demonstrating that we are home, we are not working, we need food. And being taken to prison, us lawyers like myself do not have the permit to go and represent these people's human rights. They are being taken to courts and straight away to prisons because they don't have representation by lawyers whose movement has also been restricted. So we have issues in the health sector, the schools are closed, the courts are closed, so it is a dilemma. But all this is being guided by the president will only unlock the restriction which does not really affect his grip on power. So is the current political situation of the democracy rate in Uganda, which has been threatened before, it continues to be threatened until the struggle probably can be overcome in this struggle for freedom.
Thank you very much, Sam, for sharing about the situation. About the situation in Uganda. I'm seeing a pattern with the different countries that we have presented here on how democratic processes are being undermined in the guise of the state of emergency, with how elections are endangered of being postponed in Uganda or in Serbia, or how a constitutional process in Chile is also being affected. Since we've already discussed about how our governments is using this COVID-19 crisis to affirm dominance or to oppress people or groups with different ideas, um, how are our governments using this crisis, and how does it look like? Are they passing laws with this? Are they abolishing democratic institutions? How does this oppression look like? We'll start with Anđjela.
Okay, thanks. It sounds to me like we all live in the same country. It's crazy. But on March 15th, President Aleksandar Vučić declared a state of emergency during a live press conference in response to coronavirus situation. This state of emergency was applied on public of Serbia despite the fact that according to constitution, a state of emergency must be declared by the National Assembly. This is a warning sign that the president was abusing his power and violating the constitution. And our president is known for such things throughout all his political career. So according to constitution, the president is incompetent to directly decide on anything except when the constitution explicitly requires his active role. So the president appears as an actor only when the National Assembly cannot function smoothly. But they didn't give us any explanation which would lead to conclusion that the health safe gathering and voting for MPs could not be conducted. So in this coronavirus situation, citizens of Serbia have been under curfew for 53 days. We're not under curfew anymore, but at first we couldn't go out from 8 p.m. till 5 a.m. And later it was that curfew was 12 hours long. It was from 5 p.m. till 5 a.m. And all citizens older than 65, they couldn't go out at all, except to market, which was once a week, and it was from 4 a.m. till 7 a.m. So even declaring a state of emergency in country was not enough for our president. So he continued to play a role of prime minister, to play a role of ministers of various departments, health service, volunteers, and many other roles. In this way, he showed us his deepest hatred to all institutions, which under these circumstances, those institutions should play the more visible role. So measurements of fight the corona pandemic, which were introduced by declaring a state of emergency, they have already been provided for in the law on protection of the population from infectious diseases. And so we already had that law. In that law, it primarily prohibits gathering in public places, restricts population movements in affected areas, and quarantines. So there was no need to introduce a state of emergency at all. Even if everything was formally done in accordance to constitution and laws, the question would be whether the restriction of these rights were really necessarily and proportionate in one democratic society. So question is, was it possible to prevent the spread of infection, to protect public health as legitimate goals by less restricting the rights of our elderly fellow citizens? So this difficult situation in which we are now is the best test of democracy in one state. The state of emergency was registered outside the constitution. It had no limits in time. Our assembly was practically dissolved, and the freedom of movement for the oldest was abolished. So we faced the lack of information, unethical media reporting, and inadequate addressing by top officials. So all that have contributed to feelings of uncertainty and fear among citizens, and it created a basis for spreading false news in country. The mentioned regulation has changed almost 10 times during the state of emergency. So this speaks enough about how the government of Serbia, together with president, is incompetent in managing the crisis, and even more about how much time it was available for citizens to get acquainted with the changes and to find out how they may or may not behave. So at the end of the state of emergency, the National Assembly finally met last week, and they confirmed all the measures adopted by the government of Serbia during the state of emergency. There was no debate or dissenting opinion. So after imposing this state of emergency, Serbia is closer to one-man dictatorship than ever. Our journalists were arrested. Our journalist was arrested because she pointed out the poor conditions where one hospital was treating patients. We also saw a viral video shows a police officer beating a citizen because he was out during the curfew. This regulation especially emphasized the restriction of the movement of asylum seekers and irregular migrants, which are accommodated in asylum centers. Thus, it turns out that the migrant population, regardless of age, is completely deprived of the ability to move. So there was another funny moment. At one point, the government passed a conclusion establishing a system that stipulates that only a single body can provide information to the public about spread of coronavirus in Serbia. This is the COVID-19 Crisis Management Committee, and they said that all informations must be given by the Prime Minister because she chairs the Crisis Management Committee. So this conclusion posed a threat to all journalists reporting on this. Government assumed that media coverage would then be inaccurate and unverified, and that they would only spread the misinformation. Of course, it's clear what was going to happen after this: self-censorship and censorship of media. It is quite clear that this type of centralization of information cannot meet the justified interests of public. So it's clear that it was not a question of accuracy checking, as they said, but selection of information according to their criteria. But fortunately, this conclusion was quickly drawn. Even they realized how much of a blow that would be to democracy. We're still in this corona crisis, but it's a little bit different here. But after this crisis, we realized that the biggest torture gave the worst results and the most victims in the region. So with the bans and rules changing from day to day, we cannot assess what was good and what was bad decision. We realized that because of chaos and because of burden by our own misconceptions, we learned almost nothing about the COVID-19 epidemic in Serbia. So I want to try to summarize this previous behavior of authorities. And so we have a following situation. A state of emergency has been declared unnecessarily in an unconstitutional manner. Then the National Assembly is unconstitutionally out of session. The government makes unconstitutional decisions in an unconstitutional manner and in an unconstitutional form. And the president of republic decides unconstitutionally out his constitutional powers, although all measures that are necessarily and adopted in an unconstitutional manner could be taken in compliance with constitutional provisions and the law that already existed in Serbia.
Thank you very much, Anđjela. It's very disturbing, but also very common for authoritarians to use a moment of shock and despair among the population in order to consolidate power. A question to Fernando: how is the Piñera government using the COVID crisis to repress people and to consolidate power?
Well, the situation is very similar to what Anđjela is telling us. I would like to divide my answer in two parts. First, I would like to continue with something I said in my first answer. And secondly, I would like to speak about Piñera's economic policies. So for the first part of my answer, as I already said, the COVID crisis has been utilized to postpone our constitutional process. Some right-wing political leaders, some ones who are even more radical than Piñera, are even trying to eliminate it altogether. So they want to use the COVID crisis as an excuse to eliminate all of the advances and conquests that we earned in last year's protests. Also, he's enacting more repressive laws. I believe he's preparing himself a better scenario to confront the protesters that we will surely rise again after the COVID crisis passes. And he's also raising financial resources for the military and the police forces. So amidst a crisis where we have not enough resources for medical care for everybody, he's spending state money in buying new cars, new weapons for the police. So that kind of tells you what Piñera is thinking and what he is not thinking right now. And as for the economic policies of this government, Piñera has managed really terribly this crisis. He has behaved a little bit like Donald Trump. Like, I would like to state that Piñera actually idolizes Donald Trump and he takes him as a reference for some of his policies. And you know, Piñera has been the last month or 45 days, I think, speaking of his safe return plan. He believes it is already safe to reassume the economic activity as if there was no virus threatening our health and our lives. He has been speaking of this new normality, like to connect his imagined solution to the COVID crisis with his imagined solution to the social crisis. He actually used the same words to describe the riots of October last year and the COVID crisis. He talked about his people as a powerful enemy that does not respect anything, referring to the protesters in October last year. And now he speaks of the coronavirus as a powerful enemy who respects nothing, like to try to make a parallelism in the people's imagination, but it has not worked for him. So he has been trying to combine repressive measures with liberal economic measures to reopen the markets, to regain economic activity. And in this point, he has taken an active part for the capitalist class in this crisis. Instead of enacting laws or bills to protect the working class, for example, guaranteeing the salaries for people who cannot work or economic support for self-employed workers, he has authorized employers to suspend contractual relations without paying wages. So we have people who are now this month approaching their second or third month without a pay. So actually today, the first riots began in some of the poorer places of Santiago de Chile, my city, where people are already starting to riot because they are short on food. And so the situation is getting worse with the day. So when he was demanded to establish some economic mechanism to provide sustenance for people who could not afford it, their answer was, and listen to me clearly, to have salaries paid with their own workers' saving. So the savings of the workers that are actually managed by private corporations are being used to pay salaries while big corporations do not pay them. That's not sustainable in the midterm. It will not work. I believe we will begin with strong riots very soon, and it will be bad. And you know, also Piñera's government has provided some major corporations with economic salvage with public money. Some corporations have claimed that they cannot work adequately with this crisis, and the same corporations that do not pay wages for workers who cannot work because of the quarantine are being salvaged by the state, and these same corporations are distributing profits amongst their owners. So Piñera is repressing his people, is trying to eliminate our constitutional process, he's protecting, beg your pardon, big corporations, and he's not protecting the workers. So the economic costs of the crisis has fallen pretty much integrally upon the working class pockets. The numbers of poverty in Chile are rising a lot, and I fear they may continue to rise, but businessmen have not lost a single penny of their pockets, but all the opposite. And so I believe the COVID has been used as an opportunity to gain even more money out of our lives.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for that perspective. I'd like to hear on the situation in Uganda. How is Museveni using this crisis to suppress people and opposition? Sam?
The question?
How is the government in Uganda using this crisis to oppress people and to, as you said earlier, they've used it for their own political self-interest by co-opting institutions? I'd like to hear more about it.
Yeah, well, as you said, of course, in this dispensation, the government has come up with laws, suppressive laws. And you can imagine if before COVID, we had laws which were restricting movement and gatherings, you can imagine how more repressive the new public health statutory instruments or laws, how far they can go in continuing to suppress the political space the more. If the politicians or parliament could previously pass a law which we call the Public Order Management Act, where politicians did not have the space to associate and express their political views. Now with the new COVID era, it is very apparent that the public health law or statutory instrument of COVID-19 has tightened more restrictions against political activity. The proportionality, we are not saying that we should not have the law to restrict movement and gatherings, which can cause a further spread of the disease. What we are challenging here in Uganda as activists is the proportionality of the force and the law, which is now being put in place compared to the threats by the disease. It is very apparent that when these laws were put in place, even before we got 15 sick people, we realized that the army was already on the streets because it knew that they were passing a law which was unpopular. The army got to the streets, the police and local defense unit police, and started torturing people. People were killed. We have had more people dying during this COVID era out of the wrath and violence of police and local defense units than any other disease. We've had more people die on other chronic diseases, but we do not have any person who has died of COVID. Of course, we have the laws, as we said, but those laws that have been put in place are serving political interests more than curtailing the disease. For example, there's a law that was passed. Actually, we are talking about laws, but we are talking about decrees, because it is what the wish of the president, if he comes like now, he's addressing the nation. Whatever he will say becomes law. It is from there that then it goes to parliament. It's not the other way around, that laws would come to from parliament to the executive arm of government. Actually, it's not even the executive arm of government. It is one man. He comes here on TV, tells the country on which path to take. For example, he brought a law where politicians are not supposed to distribute any materials or food to the people. And when he brought this law of politicians not being accepted to distribute food because people are hungry, people are dying of hunger, because government has closed people in their houses and it does not have the means to feed the people. So when the politicians try to take food to the people, the president came up with a law and stated that any politician who distributes food will be charged for attempted murder. That politicians now when you go out to distribute food, according to the decree by the president of Uganda, if you're giving food to your people, even to your neighbor, especially when you're a politician from the opposition, you are charged for attempted murder. One of the politicians I can talk about is a honorable member of parliament here, a member of parliament in the opposition who went to distribute food. Then this law was used against this member of parliament. He was taken to torture chambers. When he was taken to torture chambers, he was tortured, and what was being told to him were political statements and stopping him from opposing the current government. So the laws that are being used now are creating a situation where the government or the president, the dictator, is denying political space to political opposition or alternative political views. So the issue here is the proportionality of the laws that are being brought during this period. Secondly, as I've heard from other panelists here, is COVID era is being used for economic gains for people in power. We realize that it is when parliament sat to pass laws that can guide on how to bring more money for health care. Half of the budget is for classified expenditure to government. Classified expenditure is a budget for buying guns and weapons. During a health crisis, we are seeing a lot of corruption. The money is being picked because under the guise of fighting COVID, but they are buying more weapons and paying more security officials to enforce these draconian laws against the public interest. And that is what is happening in Uganda. We are seeing over 1 million people have lost their jobs during this period. And when they would want to be, at a time when they would be given something to at least repair the loss that they have faced, we see that even the small money in the coffers of government, for example, the social security funds. Social security funds are being arrogated to a Minister of Finance from the coffers of the workers' savings to politically instigated budgets. So it is quite absurd that the COVID-19 era is being misused for political gains and economic gains, especially through corruption, because we have one of the most corrupt governments in the entire continent.
Thank you for sharing, Sam. I think we can draw parallels and similarities with the situation in each of our countries. For example, instead of a health-based response where people are protected and kept safe from this virus, we're seeing an increase in militarized and punitive responses where people are being humiliated or are threatened and harassed out in the streets. We see that in Uganda and Chile. Censorship and control of information and the free press in Serbia, and is eerily happening in the Philippines too, where the biggest TV broadcast network was shut down, depriving people of any information in the middle of a pandemic. Checks and balances are also being disregarded, and alarmingly, people are profiting amid this pandemic. While we're on this point of how economic inequality is being exacerbated, where the rich, the elite, and the powerful are being given the support, are being given the bulk of funds from our taxes. How are these threats to rule of law affecting the working class, affecting vulnerable populations, affecting the poor? I'd like to hear the situation in Serbia.
Okay, so after declaring the state of emergency, the government announced specific measures to fight the COVID-19 outbreak. So schools and universities were closed. Companies were urged to let their employees work from home. And as I mentioned, curfew was imposed between 5 p.m. and 5 a.m. each day. And our most extreme measure forbade all citizens over 65 years old from leaving their homes at all. So during the COVID crisis, parliaments did not work, and criminal charges were filed against 500 elderly people who left their house arrest. That's like it's money. They didn't go to prison, but they will need to pay a lot. The police did not always act professionally. They did not act proportionately. They did not act politically neutral. They didn't take into account the needs and rights of citizens. The criteria on the basis of which the Ministry of the Interior issued movement permits during the curfew were not prescribed, and that's why they were often abused. Even people who arrived in Serbia before the declaration of the state of emergency, people who were abroad, they were often not informed that they have been imposed house quarantine measures. So some of them even went to prison, some of them had to pay a lot of money. The orders on prohibitions on movement were issued by the Ministry of the Interior. Although the restriction on the constitutional rights of citizens during the state of emergency is supposed to be prescribed by a decree issued by the government and signed by the president. Citizens in Serbia, they faced a curfew, which was different from week to week, but we have a record which is 84 hours. We were locked 3.5 days during the Orthodox Eastern holidays around April 19th. But this dictatorship wasn't just formal though. Several people, as I mentioned, who breached the curfew were beaten by the police. Videos of these cases spread through the social media and independent news. Even online trials, as we already heard, online trials for those who violated the lockdown were held in a rushed manner and without proper defense. As I mentioned, our journalist, Ana Lalic, she was arrested on April 1st on charges of causing panic for reporting on shortage of supplies and difficult working conditions in the clinical center, although her claims were later proven true. And even when the highest state official released her, they continued verbally attacking her, naming her a liar several times. So during this COVID crisis in Serbia, many people lost their jobs. Most of small shops closed soon after the state of emergency and curfew were declared. They simply could not afford it. in Serbia, about 200,000 people, which is 8% of those employed, lost their jobs during the state of emergency due to coronavirus pandemic. Some results of research shows that the greatest burden, but also the greatest risk during the COVID-19 crisis was borne by women. They made up as much as 86% of employees on the first line of infection. Increased work in household and care for family members also remained with women, who predominantly performed those jobs even before the corona crisis. For almost half of those people who lost their jobs, they lost jobs because their companies just stopped working. And another information, 1/5 of total number of people who lost their jobs, they simply was not offered a new contract after the previous one expired. In most cases, employees were forced to resign because in the state of emergency, the public transportation didn't work, the schools and kindergartens didn't work, the social support service for the elderly were suspended, and they simply could not organize themselves how to go to work and to take on the increased responsibilities for caring for family members. Among those who continued to work on the first line of health risks, the largest share was occupied by health workers, which is more than 50%, of course. Then comes trade workers, then persons engaged in hygienic activities, and among others were persons performing professional care, and as well as drivers. So, as I said, the vast majority of employees on the first line of the infection were women. This is a consequence of segregation in the labor market, which manifests itself as a pronounced concentration of women is in a care economy, the main part of which is healthcare, as well in the trade sector.
Thank you very much, Anđjela. I'd like to hear on the situation in Chile. Fernando has shared earlier on how people are being displaced and how they're receiving less wages or how contracts are canceled. I'd also like to hear about what the situation for women or indigenous or ethnic groups are like amidst this crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, that's where I wanted to start. Same as Anđjela tells us from Serbia, we also have a very segregated labor market. It is very sexist. And one of the not so visible consequences of the quarantines has been a significant raise in the numbers of sexist violence. Because, sexist violence most oftenly happens at homes. And, for a lot of women, this quarantine has meant to be locked down with the person who commits sexist violence against them. And Piñera's government has not responded. We had a ministry of the women who was pretty much useless, and she resigned like 3 months ago. And she was replaced with a woman who is an active advocate for Pinochet's government. She celebrates him. She's not she's not in accord with feminist views, so she's not being any help with this issue. And so sexist violence is one of the consequences of the COVID crisis, and Piñera's government has not responded to that. Also, I would say that the most vulnerable groups in this context have been self-employed workers. In Chile, we have a very, what is called Uberized economy. And so a lot of self-employed people have lost their jobs, or they have been forced to continue working with very poor sanitary conditions because they have to choose. It is working under those non-sanitary conditions, or not getting enough money to eat until the end of the month. And so the protests that are being reactivated today, they are kind of picking up the same lane that we opened in October last year, but now they are changing their target. You know, the target of the protests now is basically that people are starting to get hungry. It didn't happen in Chile for the last 40 years, but that's the motive of the current protests. And I insist, I believe this will be worse with the day. Another group of vulnerable people that have been exposed to danger during this crisis are immigrants. You know, Chile has had some considerable immigrant waves the last 4 or 5 years, but the policy of the government to the immigrants has not been an open policy or a helpful policy. It's been most of all a segregative policy. So we have a lot of immigrants without access to social security or to healthcare at all. We have also an important number of immigrants in a homeless situation right now. So how can you stay home if you don't have a home? Or another aspect, you know, in Chile, we are such a neoliberal country that water is a public, it is not a public resource, it is a private resource. It's owned by some families. Few families in Chile own all the water. So in some places, some more in the countryside, all of the water is directed to agricultural activities. But in those places, there are several families who do not have access to water. So we saw some people who claimed, how can I wash my hands for 15 seconds every time I come in and out of my house if I do not have access to fresh water? So I believe this COVID crisis has showed us one thing. The society as a whole was more vulnerable than we used to think. We always have known the existence of some vulnerable groups. That is bad, that should not be so, but that has been so for some time. But in Chile, we had the illusion that we had a rich society, that we have a developed economy. And this crisis has shown us that this was a pure illusion. The society as a whole is vulnerable, and the hunger protests that are beginning today are a very direct expression of that.
Thank you, Fernando. Let's hear from on the situation in Uganda with Sam. How are vulnerable groups affected by threats against rule of law and order?
Well, vulnerable groups are quite a wide spectrum. There's a point we've noted during the COVID restriction period, where there's been a lot of, one of the most affected vulnerable groups has been that affected by domestic violence in homes. We've seen so many cases of domestic violence and some deaths because of violence within homes when people are shut into their homes in the lockdown. Besides that, we are seeing that we are a community which has one of the poorest people among the poor in the world in communities. We have families which have women fending for the children in the families. So when we see continued cases of violence against women, which women mostly fend for their children and the homes, in many homes in Uganda, then there are so many people vulnerable to this. We have a very large informal sector. The informal sector employs the majority of Ugandans. And we have a very youthful, I think over 60% or 70% are youth in this country. We have a very young generation. Most of these are not in formal employment. Those in formal employment are middle-aged and grown-ups, or a bit of people in towards advanced age. So we have a conflict that the majority poorest of the poor are of course being affected by this period because most of them live hand to mouth. They are in this informal sector, which cannot be traced in as far as statistics are concerned. But in the formal sector, I've already stated that over 2 million people have already been terminated due to COVID-19 pandemic. Contracts are continuing to be terminated. Jobs are continuing to be lost because, of course, we are a private sector-led economy. The government does not have a lot of influence in the economy in Uganda. Putting that aside, we have a lot of money dependent on aid. We are getting a lot of money from grants from the IMF and other donors. This foreign aid has ended up in the hands of the haves in society. The haves in our society are the big capitalists, and the big capitalists most times are the big politicians because they are the ones who have the budget to share. Politicians often in times share the loot, which would be meant for social services like healthcare and currently food for the people who cannot fend for themselves during this period. We've seen that the reason that the only two arms of government which are operating now is the executive and the parliament. The judiciary is closed. Why is the parliament involved? Because there's a lot of money which is being borrowed under the guise of COVID-19 pandemic from the international financial institutions. Now, when this money came here, as I stated earlier, half of the budget of the supplementary budget, which was passed by Parliament, went to what we call classified expenditure. That classified expenditure, over 50%, is controlled by the Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces, who is also the president of this country, President Museveni. When you look at the food aid, the other half of the budget has food aid and adverts or communication and the like. But you'll find that even the food contracts arising out of the 50% remaining budget, these contracts again end up in the first family. They are belonging to companies. The contracts are being given to contracts of the first family and the political circle around the president of this country. So you can see how large the economic gap will continue, because that is why they push away all other people from food distribution and leave it for the first family. Now, the other batch of the money has gone to media. It has not gone to media so that people can freely express themselves as journalists. We have a censored media. The censored media is the media broadcasts what is in the good books of the dictator, of President Museveni. And these media companies, which have not been frustrated, which have not been closed by government, because several media houses have been closed for being in opposition or critical to government. The remaining media houses have been given a big chunk of this money for TV, adverts, and communication. Now, radio and TV communication in Uganda is for politicians. It is gagged. So now we have recently seen the fight for the money in the gap up the ladders. We've seen a fight between the Speaker of Parliament, the Honorable Kadaga, and President Museveni. And the fight is not about how the people are faring. It is about how much money you are taking. We've seen members of Parliament being given a bonus, each of over 10,000 US dollars, just around this time, bonuses. So politicians are sharing money at the expense of the people. And people are just getting leftovers. That's why people have started rising up from their homes. People have started coming up to demonstrate against hunger, demonstrate against the inequality. Because the money, the trillions that are being borrowed by this government are against the collateral of the people of the Ugandans. And they're not seeing it come to their homes. Even the few food items that are being distributed have been donated by the people, because there's a call from the president and government for people, private people and companies to come and donate. He is actually determining even what should be donated. And because capitalists want to have the favor of the politicians, they are bringing the food, and it's the food being distributed to the people. But the actual money that should go as food aid, medicine, and the like that is much required during this period is ending up in the fat pockets again of those up the ladders, most of whom are politicians. So after COVID, we do not know where this will end. Of course, if you're to talk about the income of the downtrodden, the people in the ghettos, the people in the outskirts, the people in the villages, if you restrict movement of a person who gains from the informal sector, a person who only gains because they have gotten from their home to the street to go and do some odd jobs, if you restrict movement, it means you've completely cut off any economic income from these people. So by the end of this era, we do not know when it will end. There's a lot left to be desired or to be seen in as far as the pathetic living conditions of the poor people in Uganda. And as I stated on the index, some of those who are the most poorest of the poor along the globe. The statistics are showing us people are dying, as I stated earlier, during this time. People are dying because of even curable diseases, because they cannot access any health service, because they cannot have the money to go to hospital, because they cannot ride the bicycle, because the only means of transport they can access is probably a bicycle, which probably they cannot afford because public transport has been cut off, because you cannot move. We have no ambulances. The healthcare system does not have ambulances. And even when people volunteer to be taken to hospitals, you find the army on the streets that you need a permit even to go to hospital. So really, really, the COVID came at a time when we did not actually need any more curtailment than we are seeing now, especially for the poor people in our communities back in Uganda, and generally in the poorest countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you very much, Sam. I completely agree with all your analysis for our panel here, that the much vaunted invisible hand appears to be just strangling the working class right now, where privatization of public services is hurting the poor, where even just the act of washing your hands has become a privilege, where segregated labor market according to gender is disproportionately affecting women, and how loans and donations from financial institutes are only benefiting the elite and the powerful instead of those at the bottom rung of our society. Now, I have one last question, but I think I can ask this in the last 10 minutes of our call. We have 20 minutes uh, left for this webinar, but I'm going to take one question from Facebook first. What are your thoughts on the new Progressive International? I believe they're referring to this new group started by DM25 and the Sanders Institute and a whole lot of other progressive groups. Do you think that platform could strengthen common struggles towards democratic freedoms? We'll start first with Anđjela. We're just going to have short answers for the next few questions. And also for those who are watching, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box right below your screens. Go ahead, Anđjela.
Thank you. So as we heard today, we are like in 3 different continents, but we still struggle with the similar problems. So this question about forming alliance, some progressive international, it sounds good because it will like straighten. We can share our problems and some ways to resolve them. So I think it sounds good. It gives hope, but we still everyone needs to do on in their own country and to try to fight it for the best of people.
Thank you. Okay.
Well,
Fernando,
yes.
do you want to answer? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I believe the COVID crisis has shown us, or rather reminded us, that the major problems of humanity are global problems. And so their solutions must also be global. And I believe the COVID crisis has also shown us that our actual global leaders cannot be trusted. And this is a serious problem if you take into account that COVID-19 is not our worst global problem. I believe it actually is the global warming, the climate change. And if we do not develop the capacities, the abilities to act globally, we will not be able to confront this challenge and the global warming challenge. So yes, I believe we need some kind of international coordination to ensure our efforts go into the right directions. I'm not sure if this progressist international is the one we need, but I believe it's moving to the right direction. So yes, I think it's a good thing. But also, as Anđjela says, the urgent part of the problem demands local action. Whatever else we do internationally, we must start locally. So yes, I agree with Anđjela.
Thank you, Fernando. Yes, Sam.
I think it's a global disease which needs a global attention. And it's one of the means which we've seen that some issues do not have borders. This disease has no borders. We've seen that most of the vulnerable people that the progressive movement, whose rights the global progressive movements fight for, are the most affected, given the debate that we've had all along. It shows us that now than ever before, we need solidarity across the globe. We need to have a forum and a platform of solidarity where we can all share like we are sharing now. I believe it is one of those means, not the only means, it's one of those means that can be used for a better future, because we should be all over this world to change it.
Thank you very much. Yes, I totally agree. A systemic problem also needs systemic solutions. And as we have discussed the situations in our countries, it appears that our leaders are also using the same tactics, and therefore we should also be learning from each other on how we battle these tactics. I'm just gonna read the two questions so that we can run through them and answer them at the same time in the last 15 minutes of our call. There's a question here from our audience. What are the challenges of political parties to recover democracy? And the second question would also be, what can we do to support you, your group, your movement, and how do you keep on fighting amidst this crisis? Let's hear from Anđjela.
So this first question about political parties, how to recover democracy, it is not really, it's not easy right now in Serbia. We're deep in corruption, and nothing works anymore. Institution doesn't work. There is no space in media to people to hear something that opposition party have to say. So first we need to change this regime. For the past few years, around elections times in Serbia, people have taken to the streets to protest government corruption, to protest attacks on free press and voter suppression. So this spring, because of COVID-19 pandemic, activists needed to find a new way to protest the country's increasingly repressive government. On the day that elections were supposed to be held on April 26th, we, Initiative Davimo Beograd, we called the citizens to stay at their windows and to participate in protest called Raise Your Voice, Noise Against Dictatorship. This action was held every night, 5 minutes after 8 p.m., and it encouraged a lot of people to come to their windows and balconies to make noise against the regime by banging pots and pans, shouting, playing instruments, playing music, blowing whistles, or anything else that they could, because we couldn't go out at all. And this is like the only way to people show these governments that they still can think and that they want to fight and that they're ready to change this system. So this our nightly noise making has drawn thousands of people to participate from all over the country. Public outrage has grown in recent years to corruption in Serbia's government. So from mass demonstration 4 years ago after an illegal demolition of one part of city to the last year's protests that held every Saturday for almost a year against the state's repression. Now in the COVID crisis, citizens fear that the government is using this crisis to violate democratic freedoms. And with these balcony protests, public outrage is spreading in opposition to President Aleksandar Vučić's abuses of power, including the arrest of journalists and manipulating elections. So we also, besides this noise-making protest, it was just one element of how Davimo Beograd have been organizing demands since the state of emergency began. We called the city officials to make bike lanes because the public transportation didn't work, because there was not people driving cars that much. But our perception of democracy is that it has to be bottom up, and that only through the involvement of a great number of citizens we can bring real change in politics. These are the ideas we promoted when we ran in the Belgrade elections in 2018, and although we received over 30,000 votes, we did not win enough to gain seats in the Belgrade parliament, but we will continue to promote those ideas and to learn from our mistakes as a movement and to prove our efforts. So we believe that decision-making has to include us, the citizens, and this is the only first step towards a more participatory society.
Thank you, Anđjela. What about the situation in Chile? How are political parties key to recovering democratic freedoms? And at the same time, how can the international groups support the cause in Chile?
Well, this is a complicated question, at least in Chile, right? Because the perception of the majority of the people is that political parties are actually part of the problem of our pseudo-democracy. So what I would like to begin with is that to understand how to recover democracy, we must first understand how we lost democracy. And in Chile, it is very graphic. You know, we lost democracy to the hands of the capitalist class. The coup d'etat performed by Pinochet in 1973 was the first step in the hijacking of our democracy. And that democracy, that pseudo-democracy, has been administrated for the last 40 years for the same political parties that claim to be our representatives. So kind of like in Serbia, it's like the whole political system was part of the problem of the non-democracy we live in. So the capitalist class that took away the democracy and hid it in their pocket, they have a lot of means to ensure this non-democratic situation, right? Anđjela and Sam have named several of those: repression, restrictions on free press, and so on. And those of us who are in for democracy, we have only one force, we have only one power, and that is the power of the people. And I believe one central aspect of recovering democracy is trusting in the power of the people. I believe the rebellion in last October in Chile showed us what people can do when they unite and they stand together against anti-democratic regimes, such as Piñera's government in Chile. And so I believe what we need to answer the question directly is, first of all, new political parties. In Chile, pretty much all of the political parties of the established regime are functional to its non-democratic condition. The answer, the solution will not come by their hand. So I believe we need new political parties that trust the power of people and that conceive themselves as a means for the power of people to express itself, not as somebody to manage people's business away from people. No, means for the people to express themselves. I believe we need new political parties if we want to regain a new democracy. And as for the last question, I believe we already answered this in the prior question about the Progressive International, but I would like to emphasize that we need, as Sam said, first solidarity, to share experiences, to share knowledge. We need visibility. One of the most helpful things during our riots last year was the international support that puts press against our political leaders and gives the people more power. And with solidarity and visibility and dialogue, we should aim to global action. And I believe global action is the ultimate form of collaboration we need to confront this and the other crises we must confront.
Thank you, Fernando. I'm reminded of the popular slogan, El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, with the call for trusting the power of the people. Let's hear from Sam on the situation in Uganda, on the role that political parties play, and at the same time, how the international can support your cause.
Yes, I like that power for the people. Actually, in Uganda, we have a movement called the People Power Movement. It's actually led by an artist, the names of Bobby Wine. So people have taken back their power from the political parties. People are actually now determining events more than the political parties, because there is a challenge that political parties actually ought to challenge the repressive measures, but they have oftentimes not acted in the interest of the people, often in times that now people are now working against the dictatorship more within pressure groups, which is not very rosy for democracy in our country, that people can take the power in their hands. So we need, as political organizations, to campaign for more democracy. That's the most important aspect. We have to fight. The most important job now is to fight apathy, because we have had people in Uganda who do not believe that a ballot or a vote can change government. People believe governments are only changed by force because they have not seen it. People have not seen one political leader or president handing over peacefully to another. So now with this COVID-19 and other repressive issues coming up, it means people are now apathetic. So political parties have to come up and ensure that there's no more apathy within the people, even during this time. So political parties have to fight that apathy. Of course, people are now seeing as if it's a new normal. You know, that is another issue. The apathy is coming in because people, even where they are being repressed, because they're telling them it's about your health, you'll get sick, then it's a new normal that rights can be curtailed. So people, political parties and activists, we have come out and tell the people that even during such crisis, we do not give a blank check to the dictator to even cancel elections. So people's voices have to be raised, especially by groupings like political parties, to tell people that even during COVID, you have the right to be part of the decision-making process. If a democratic right is to be affected, political parties have to participate, for example. If elections are to be probably extended, political parties have to be involved. You should not leave it to the current president. So it's about raising the voice to fight for this, the struggle for the civic space, which I said has already been taken away from us. It has been repressed so much for so long. Before COVID, during COVID, we should not accept for even the small space we had to be closed. That is what we need to do as political parties, as political activists. And the international community has to come up to assist us amplify the voice of the voiceless. For example, if I cannot, with this curtailment of the freedom of the press, the few fora that we are remaining with are social media. Social media is not the best medium to use in a country like in Uganda, because the message will not go down up to the voter who do not have the medium to associate, but that like some and other activists can now communicate on such platform to have a voice across the world. Then that is when the international medium has to come in to support, especially the fight against dictators. International community and governments in democracy should stop supporting dictators, because the more they are supported, the more they hold on to power, and the more they use the disproportionate force to put the country under siege economically, under siege politically, and under siege without rights to associate and to enjoy the freedoms that must be enjoyed by any human being. I thank you. I think on this, I see time is running out, but we should not run silent. We should not run silent. That is the message. We should struggle on, because for us here, the struggle is our life.
Thank you very much, Sam. And I'd like to thank everyone here in this panel for their time and for sharing the different lessons and situation and stories from their countries, a lot of which we will be learning from, and to our audience and the organizers from Solidaritat for the space to be able to share. Personally, it's like a support group, a therapy group for me, because we're in the Philippines. We're also going through the same thing, disturbingly the same patterns of human rights violations, the same way of consolidating power through emergency bills, a militarized response, and also exacerbating social inequality. But what I'm most interested about is that how interconnected our struggles and our solutions to this crisis are. And I think that's where we imagine the new normal with these spaces, you know, because we can't go back to the old order, because that was exactly what brought this problem. But we need to imagine the new systems in political, social, and economic, on how we can able to provide a world that is, you know, shared by all. And I'm seeing it with how similar our systems are, um, because in Serbia you have noise barrages where you clang your pots and pans. We do that too in the Philippines. It's called kalampagan. And I think in Chile too, with the cacerola so, where you have noise barrages as well in protest, and the same concept of people power in Uganda. And so we are connected more than we think we are. And we need to bank on our connectedness. So I thank everyone for their time and for their stories. This has been a really nice presentation.